And a one and a two and a nasi fa do ba da ba ba beep ba ba bep 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 Welcome to uh, Wednesday I'm in Love morning editions. Mornings where we have to speak. I'm trying to talk lower so I don't disturb anybody while my neighbors have screaming contests every day. They're very nice people, big fans of Picks of the Week. Okay. So I'm still not caught up. I had Sunday and Monday off. But I don't know, sometimes this happens and it's unfortunate. But I just get kind of burnt out on reading comics. I read a lot, but I still didn't even finish 2 weeks ago. I'm still, is that right? 2 weeks ago? Yeah. I also made a discovery, I guess you could call it. Not a discovery, but this is another thing. This is another pattern that tends to emerge. Is I'll part of why it becomes kind of a chore to read comics is that I start buying titles out of momentum. The most, the clearest example I can draw for you lately is that back about 3 years ago now, Jonathan Hickman, the great writer Jonathan Hickman, kind of took over the X-Men line of comics, um, and sort of, you know, he made a lot of real changes, and it was like a much different thing, and it's been great. But I was like really into it. Still am. I was buying every single title in the X line, and there's no need. I don't need to do that. Especially, and again, I don't want nothing against any brick and mortar, particularly the one I work at. But with that Marvel app, I don't need to buy any of them. But yeah, there's a couple of titles of the X line that I was just like, I don't need to read this every month. They're all fine still, but that's the thing is like I'll start buying titles that are just fine or that I want to have because I think that's the other thing too with the X Men line in particular. I have this thing where I want the entire run, whether or not I like the entire run is irrelevant, and that's a goofy thing that comic book collectors do. I just have to watch out for it. So I cut a few titles this week. Still, I think I could do a little bit better, but it doesn't help that there are actually good comics coming out these days. First of this week, Sacrament #1 at AWA. This is another book by Peter Milligan. And I do know Marcelo Fruson's name, though I couldn't tell you from what. I don't know anything about this. It looks satanic, so I'm on board. It's a Peter Milligan book, so that's the end of that. This is one I was on the fence about, but I ended up going ahead with it. This is Golden Rage #1. I mean, all previous. The word on this is that it's really, really good, and it's like battle royale, but for the elderly. So that is fun. And it's like it's all female creators, which is pretty cool. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I think that'll be fun. And then also this week, this was my pick for the shop as well. This is Survival Street #1 from Dark Horse. This is written or co-written anyway by James Asmus, who was around quite a bit in Marvel. I want to say in like the late teens. He wrote an Inhumans title. I looked it all up the other day. Now I can't remember. Inhumans is what I remember mostly, and I always liked his stuff. And then he seemed to kind of drop out of sight, but now he's back. Survival Street is, I mean, it's kind of obvious on the face of it, but it's a post-apocalyptic Sesame Street where after the apocalypse, there's no more funding for public television, so these puppets have to go out and survive. It's weird to me, this sort of thing. When I was very young, the mere thought of this sort of thing would give me nightmares. And I always really hated when, I mean, I wouldn't have been able to tell you this because I was 8, but I always hated when something innocent and light got dark. Bambi meets Godzilla upset me very much when I was a boy. Things like that. Whenever there was when things took a dark turn, I would have the normal human reaction of being repulsed by it. It wasn't until I was an adolescent that I started seeking that sort of thing out because, you know, when you're a little kid, you're just all why, and you think the world is this big great place, and when things come, when reality, or at least bad things come crashing in, you know, you start to second guess that. And then by the time you're an adolescent, you are no longer second guessing it. That's become your, well, in my case, certainly it becomes your primary point of view. So, yeah. I will say, though, I am a little reluctant because every time I've seen something like this, like I'm mostly thinking of the early Peter Jackson film, Meet the Feebles, which if you haven't seen is worth checking out. But Meet the Feebles was a pretty, it was a Muppet show, basically. And then all the Muppets were like normal actors, so there's fucking and there's swearing and there's all kinds of you know adult things going on. There's a flashback to the Vietnam War at one point, if I remember right, and it was good, but yeah, it always kind of leaves me cold. I think Melissa McCarthy did a recent movie along these lines too, where she played a homicide detective. She was searching for the killer of a Muppet. It's just a lot of the time it feels like the premise is so out there that it immediately just kind of falls back onto the same hacky shit. And it's like, oh, this puppet's doing heroin. Okay. I know it's cynical, but it just kind of, I don't know. But I flipped through this and looked at, and like, I love this cover, and it's Asmus, so I think this will be, of this kind of little subgenre, I think this will be one of my picks of the week, not of last week, because that would just be chronologically impossible at this point with our technology. So even though I have been kind of burning out on comics a little bit, I still had a lot of fun reading. This was pretty much what I expected. So this is Ant-Man #1 by Al Ewing. It's going to be a 4-issue or 5-issue miniseries, but each one is going to focus on a different Ant-Man. So this is Hank Pym, the original Ant-Man, and this story takes place in the Silver Age, which I had a feeling this was going to be one of those where it's going to take. I think the next one kind of jumps very forward to when Eric O'Grady was Ant-Man, which would have been in the late aughts, mid to late aughts. But that's an era that I really enjoy, especially kind of a guy at the shop recently donated to us his entire collection. So he's got books going back 20 years, and going through the books they're all out of order. But so going through them, I've run across a lot of like Fear Itself and Original Sin and Civil War and stuff like that. And those are all, I really like that era of big Marvel crossovers, which I think we can now officially call the Bendis era of Marvel Comics, which I would say is from turn of the century up till he bailed about 5 years ago. So, roughly 20-year stretch. Not bad. Why did I get on? I don't remember. It doesn't matter. I also read Magic Order 3, #1. Not only that, I also went back and I read the Magic Order 1 and 2. So now I remember that the family is called the Moonstone family. And I also realized what it is. I'm pretty sure Magic Order is definitely one of my favorite comics of the last few years. And despite the fact that I had to kind of reread it to refresh myself. But I mean, that was the thing, is I had to refresh myself. But it was kind of like reading them all over again, and they're great, great fun. I don't generally go in for the urban fantasy. I'm totally on board with, but the magic stuff in general, it's a very fine line because urban fantasy tends to utilize magic quite a bit, and I'm talking like literal wands and things like that. The Harry Potter series went right past me. That whole phenomenon remains completely foreign to me, and I'm okay with it. I'm not going to shit on it because it's not the 90s anymore. But it legitimately just never made sense to me. That the first book came out in the year 99, 2000. This is what I'm in the year 2000. Uh, my cousins, kind of distant cousins, who now live in Florida and are probably all grown men. They were super into it, and they were like, I think Gabriel was like junior high. Yeah, I think Gabe and Jared were both like junior high kids, and RJ I think was too little to read, but yeah, the two older ones loved it, and I was like, oh cool, I'm not gonna. And I was like, it was just a huge thing, and I know it was like right away too, where people were like, oh, I know it's for kids, but I love it. I think that's a large part of it. People who don't normally read were attracted to that series, and so I was forced to come to the conclusion that it was for dum dums. It's very snobbish. It's very elitist of me. Um, Prove me wrong, I guess, because I I can't think of it. And then this is coming from a man who owns more comic books than he does anything else. So I couldn't possibly get on my high horse about children's literature. But I don't read comics because I can't read big boy books. I read those all the time too. I'm a very well read man. As you can tell by how much loneliness I have. Another thing about the Harry Potter franchise that I think always kind of didn't really interest me was that it had that whole Sorcerer's Apprentice vibe to it. Now that cartoon I love, but I like Kazam and all the Quidditch bullshit and all that. I was just like, eh. What is the difference, Jim? Why do you like Magic Order? I'll tell you why. Because where Harry Potter is the X Men, if it was a magic thing, Magic Order is the Sopranos, the Magic Mafia. The Magic Order themselves consist mostly of are led by the Moonstone family. So you have the Magic Order is a worldwide conglomeration of wizards and magicians who are there to protect Earth from the most horrific magical menaces. And in each arc so far, they've had like one big enemy to fight, obviously. And it's super violent and a lot of swearing and there's sex. But then there's also a bunch of magic that goes on. It's really fun stuff. The artist on this one is Gigi, how do you say it? Cavanago, which I'm not familiar with, but definitely a good call because the artist in the first series was Olivier Coipel, who French guy, obviously, brilliant artist. And then he got Stuart Immonen to do the second series, another brilliant artist, similar styles. And this artist I'm not familiar with going in, but a very similar style. And so, yeah, this is one of the Magic Order who I think is going to end up being the kind of big bad for this series. But I don't want to spoil the other two. I think this also. I'm starting to get actually excited for the TV show though, because mostly just because I'm curious to see what they're going to do with it, and it feels like it always has felt like. Obviously, a lot of comics get made into TV or movies, especially by Mark Millar. Like that's by design since the beginning of his career, especially once he went kind of indie and wasn't writing for the big two as much anymore. They were all storyboards for movies or TV shows, and most of them have been dog shit. I haven't seen most of them, so I guess I shouldn't even say that. I haven't seen. Have I seen none of them? I've seen none of them. There was that terrible Wanted movie from like '06. There was Jupiter's Legacy Netflix show, which got canceled. I think the same day it dropped or the same week. That doesn't necessarily mean anything. That probably, if anything, probably means I'll like it more. um, the Kick-Ass movies, which the second one I didn't bother with the first one, and then the second one I think bombed so hard that the third one, which they did a comic book series of, the third one never got made, which is for the best. Is that it? He's got this. They got the Super Crooks Netflix show, which I haven't. I also have not watched, and I haven't heard anything bad about it, but I haven't heard anything about it. So what about that? So Magic Order though feels like it's the most. This was the first title that he put out with sponsorship from Netflix. Like I think Netflix still has ads, So this was like the first one where the connection from comic book to television couldn't have been made more clear, and then it's been trapped in development hell for the last 5 years. And I feel like the only reason he keeps putting books out is to try to get the show going. And they all, in the back matter, all the characters' designs are like, oh, these are based on what the TV show people came up with. And now that I'm saying it out loud, I hate it. I'm just, like I say, I'm just really intensely curious to see if the show holds up to the comic book. Will it? Probably not, but that doesn't mean I'm not curious. Also, this is an incredible one. Superman Space Age #1 by Mark Russell and the All Reds. As I mentioned last week, I have read stuff by Mark Russell before and have been left somewhat cold. I talked to a guy yesterday, in fact, though, who's like a huge fan. He said, "Oh, he doesn't write like anybody else," and I was like, because honestly, what really put me off, and I might have mentioned this last week specifically, the Mark Russell book I read that I really did not like was called Second Coming, and I think I did mention this last week, where Jesus comes back and has to figure out this modern world. And I think there's a superhero element to it too, but I really don't remember because honestly, it had just been done to death. What would happen if we found Jesus Christ here in our modern age? I think it might go a little something like this, and it's just enough. I honestly think Jesus stuff you can't do anymore after Preacher. That's ridiculous. I mean, people should do whatever stories they want to do, and there's other stories to tell about Christian mythology. I love calling it that. But that particular, I mean, Preacher doesn't. I don't even know if Jesus shows up in Preacher. I really can't remember now. Gosh, I should reread Preacher. It's been a long time. But this is a whole nother kettle of fish. This is what in the old days they would have called an Elseworlds, I believe. This is the Superman and also like a lot of the other DC characters if they had come about in the early 60s. So within DC continuity, which is not as stringent as Marvel continuity is, Superman lands in Smallville in the late 30s, and or I guess, yeah, it would be much earlier than that, in fact, because then he becomes Superman in the late 30s, early 40s. And then that's been kind of fudged over time as time marches on. It's like, oh, they'll make it look like it's the 80s or something. Marvel does this way more too. Elseworlds was a line of books that DC would do, and they were usually like this, like thicker, square bound, prestige format. They used to call it in the 90s, and they were that was their What If. Marvel has What If. DC had Elseworlds, and the Elseworlds books were nicer than the What If books. They were more like one shots usually, and it was just take these characters and put them in a different thing. Why they didn't brand this as an Elseworlds, I don't know. But this in this instant in this book, Clark Kent goes to Metropolis and Kennedy is president, and the Beatles show up, and yeah, it's really really fun. It's Mike Allred, honestly. It could be complete dog shit, but it's not. It's a really good book, and I also just really like the '60s, and I think Allred's style definitely has that '60s vibe, and just so yeah, it all just adds up for me. And I had a feeling it would, even though I'm not a huge DC guy. I do like Superman, but I wouldn't say I'm a huge Superman guy. So yeah, this is a lot of fun. Superman Space Age Book 1. I'm Jimmy the Worm saying, all right, I'm gonna wrap up.